Welcome to the FarrCast, bringing you insights into Wall Street, Washington, and the world. And now here's your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome to the FarrCast. I am Michael Farr. Thanks so much for joining us again this week. It is the 27th day of June as we're recording here, the last week of the last month of the second quarter. The year, believe it or not, is half over. Halfway point. The days are already starting to get shorter. I hate that, by the way. Hate that. But still lots of daylight and a lovely summer, albeit hot around the country. Wall Street has been hot for the first 6 months of the year. Stocks have done very well. Bonds have done very well. The Fed is saying that inflation is moving in the right direction, but not yet. We're not cutting rates yet. We've been talking about these things. And then, of course, tonight, if you hear the 27th, we have the presidential debate. We have Donald Trump and Joe Biden going to debate each other tonight. This feels like signing up to go watch a car wreck. I think there's no question but that it will be cringeworthy, and I think it's going to be very important. I think it's going to be very important in terms of showing which one you think you can reliably rely on to be not as awful as the other guy. That's it. What guy is not going to be as awful as the other guy? Which will stumble? In the days leading up to this particular debate, President Biden's has fallen in the polls by 4 full percentage points. President Trump is holding in. If President Biden does not have a big win tonight, that campaign is in trouble. And indeed, there's a chance that the Democratic Party will replace him as their candidate. We will see, and it's something I want to discuss with Dan Mahaffee. How does that happen procedurally? How much time does it take? Who would they get? The second bench is something that the Democrats haven't talked about a lot. The Republicans talk a lot about their vice presidential candidates, and we saw the crew who came out to try to get the presidential nomination that it seemed President Trump had sewn up from the beginning. I was asked by Bankrate.com, and I've written an article about which, and I get asked this a lot, which will be better for the economy? And the answer is neither. Neither. President Trump's agenda, economic agenda, and President Biden's economic agenda and actions and priorities are bad for the economy. That's not political, folks. That's just stating the fact. Both want to find ways to spend more money that the government doesn't have that's simply going to add to the debt. As of right now, estimates have now changed for the deficit spending in 2024, this year, to $2 trillion. $2 trillion. We have $34.5 trillion in debt right now as a country. At the end of this year, it's creeping up. It's probably already 35 point something. It's going to move again to $36 trillion in debt as Janet Yellen has to sell bonds, which means borrow money in order to pay our bills. Remember my illustration a couple of weeks back where I said, geez, you have $440,000 in income and you spend $610,000 a year, and that's really going to be your plan for a long time? Well, let's bump that number a little bit and say you have $440,000 in income and you're going to spend $640,000 a year instead of $610,000 last year. You just decided to up it by another 30 grand and you're going to borrow that money too. Really? That's your plan? That's your plan. I was talking yesterday with a very thoughtful and very bright client who said, Michael, what do we do? How long does this go on? Why do they keep doing this? Why do they keep doing it? Because they're giving you money. And each is going to argue about how he can give you more money and more benefits than the other guy, and why the other guy is going to be worse for you, but they're going to give you more. Gone are the days of Bill Clinton's fiscal responsibility, and he didn't have a deficit. Under Bill Clinton, we had a surplus. We had a surplus. You can criticize President Clinton any way you want along your partisan lines. You cannot argue with those results. They're just facts, folks. When he was president, the United States brought in more money than it spent. That doesn't happen anymore, and it hasn't really happened since Bill Clinton. Gone are the days of Ronald Reagan, who asked us to be better, who suggested that America was a shining city upon a hill, that there was a certain American exceptionalism, that we should work harder, that we should try harder, that we should encourage our children to do better, outperform, and study. And that, yes, not only could we militarily kick the rest of the world's ass, we were going to do it in a noble way. We were going to be noble ass kickers, I think, according to President Reagan. We were going to be that quiet power who ruled kindly and nobly, and that we would lead the world by example. Well, that's gone. Where is that? Where's the politician who wants to tell us that America is not only great, but can be better? That we are not only being, but becoming. And the way that we are becoming is a choice every day, that we have to raise our sights, that we have to remember that we've done something that the rest of the world has never done, that this is the greatest political and economic experiment ever, with wild success. And the success of America has raised the quality and standard of living for the entire world, not just this country, the entire world. We are the economic powerhouse of the globe, and we are squandering that position daily as we spend ourselves blindly into debt in order for politicians to stay in office. So it looks like it's going to continue. What do you do about it, Farr? You reform Social Security and you index the retirement age to life expectancy. We don't guarantee a retirement. We don't guarantee a retirement. There's no democratic value that suggests that. Lots of socialistic values suggest that. Democratic don't. Capitalistic don't. You don't spend money that you don't have. How about that? So all of a sudden, when Social Security was started at age 65, life expectancy was right around 64 and change. If you beat the life expectancy, they didn't want you eating cat food out of a cardboard box. We were going to take care of our elderly. That's why it was started, not to see how many years you could retire and keep collecting a government check. And no, you haven't paid in most people's cases, anywhere near the amount of money that you're going to take out. You can say that it's my money. Well, part of it's your money, but part of it's not. And most people, if they live a full life to life expectancy at 78 years old, will take out more money from Social Security in benefits than they paid in. Period. Do the math. Do the math. That's my money. You've got to give me that money. How about if life expectancy is 78, that over the next, I don't care, 5 or 10 years, we increase the retirement age as every American's living longer with AI and new drugs and GLP-1s that help everything from losing weight to ingrown toenails, it seems. How about we recognize that we're all living longer? This is getting more expensive than we thought, and people are healthier longer, and you're going to work till you're 75. Oh my God, I've got to work till I'm 75? Yes. Why do I have to work till I'm 75? Who's supposed to take care of you? Why is it the government's job to take care of you? We are a self-reliant people. We are the people who choose opportunity. And we say we can do it ourselves. We'll be just fine. We can do it. And you know why we can do it? Because we don't live in China. And because we don't live in some socialistic country, or yes, some banana republic where there is some strong man who dictates how much he gets and how little you get. That's America. Americans can do it. Americans can succeed. Americans can work, and Americans are determined, and nobody's going to beat us when we put our mind to accomplishing something. And yes, that includes ourselves, for ourselves, in our own interest, for our own families, so that our children can indeed enjoy better lives than we indeed enjoyed. And that's what our great-grandparents did and grandparents did and parents did in this country to provide. So we need folks who lead us towards responsible decisions and a sustainable future. And if I could get half of these environmentalists who are determined to have a sustainable future, and I'm all for that too, by the way, if I could get them to say economic future instead of environmental future, we might start to get on the right course. We need a sustainable economic future, and we do not have one. And this idea that we can fall back on this smarmy sense that we're the world's reserve currency and therefore everybody else has to kowtow and bend the knee to the United States is just folly. We could have the yuan, China's yuan currency, as the world currency before you know it. And then what have you got? A lot of debt and people who don't want to loan to you. In fact, Alan Greenspan 25 years ago suggested that by the year 2050, the world's reserve currency would be the yuan. I don't know if he's right. I don't know if he's wrong, but I don't like that idea. I don't like anything other than the US dollar. And we are squandering our position of economic strength. And it is one of the biggest, I think, crises and dangers facing us. So this presidential election is very important, and I hate both choices. I'm sure many of you do too. I'm not sure how I'm going to vote, but I do know where these policies lead, and I don't like the outcome. I'm going to watch this debate tonight very, very closely. I think it is President Trump's to lose at this point. And even if President Trump loses this, he moves on and gathers headlines by talking about his new vice presidential pick. He can up that by a couple of weeks and get back in the polls. He's got more hearings coming up where he can be victimized. He's got plenty of ways to steal the stage. So President Biden has the most at stake tonight, in Farr's opinion, and we wish both of them the best because we'd like to see America look good, because everybody should pray for the President of the United States every day, no matter who the President of the United States happens to be. We want the President of the United States to be the best he or she can be, to do the best he or she can, to succeed in every way. That's what we want for America. Shouldn't be that hard. Coming up, Dan Mahaffee is going to explain almost all of this to us today, I hope. And we have a special treat. We have economist Claudia Sahm, who has the Sahm indicator out there, the Sahm rule, an economist who says you have to see, she's the one who said you have to see that 0.5 point increase in unemployment as a sign before you go into recession. We're going to see what she sees now. She's been on TV a bunch lately, and she's going to appear live here on the FarrCast. Up next, Mahaffee. Please stay with us.
Thank you for joining us this week on the FarrCast. Now it's time for political analyst Dan Mahaffee and your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome back to the FarrCast. Here we go, second quarter, but tonight, ending second quarter, beginning the third quarter of 2024, is the big presidential debate. Dan Mahaffee joins me now, the vice chairman of the board for the Dr. Scholl Foundation, still a scholar for the president's Center for the Presidency and Congress, and the senior political analyst on the FarrCast. Welcome back, Dan.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be talking with you as always.
Thank you, Dan. What a day. And Dan, you know, I have to tell you, I was talking with a listener last night who was telling me how much she enjoyed the FarrCast, and she's been listening for years. And she said, I love that brilliant man, Mahaffee, though he sounds like much of a Republican, too much of a Republican for me. He's still very calm and very bright, and I love to hear what he thinks. So Congratulations, Dan.
Well,
I,
look at it this
I
way.
like the
If
thing.
if if liberals think I'm too Republican and conservatives think I'm too Democrat, then perhaps I'm doing something right.
I feel the same way. I catch that all the time. The problem with you damn Democrats and the problem with you damn Republicans. I get both. Um, Somehow it just people like to criticize me one way or the other. It doesn't matter apparently why. It
We
just
have critiquable faces.
yes, I guess so.
Yeah.
Dan, what's at stake tonight?
Look, as we've talked about this, end of the beginning and setting the tone for really the start of the campaign in earnest. We've had the primaries, which have not really been primaries in a sense. As we've said, and I think I've said before many times on the podcast, the people who don't have an opinion about these candidates are on that atoll with the Japanese soldier who hasn't surrendered yet. Uh,
Yes.
this is the type of environment where what we're really looking to do is break through some of those misconceptions or perceptions that each candidate sees as their headwinds, and how can they get through those headwinds to break down the other guy. So I don't think this is going to be a very pretty sight. But for Team Biden, it's obviously how do you get past and let's frankly think about it this way. The conversations we have with folks about these two candidates, the first thing you hear about when you have these conversations, that's what these candidates are going to be trying to dissuade voters of thinking during this debate. So when you talk about Biden, the first thing you hear about his age, of course. Every conversation I've had with folks about this election and Biden comes down to his age. And from there, is he effective? Is he capable? Can he stand up in office to the threats and challenges they see around the world? All of that is, I think, key for Biden to show that he's still got that vitality, that he can get through the being the oldest president, and perhaps on some of these age things, turn them back on Trump himself, who is not a spring chicken as well. For Trump, again, the first thing we hear when we have conversations with folks about Trump, who is it his temperament? Is who's he going to surround himself with? What is his goals? But it really comes down to is Trump going to be that same, and not my words, the words of former Republican Governor Tim Pawlenty, dissuading folks that Trump's, quote, a maniac. And those are the stakes of, do you convince the public that Biden can overcome his age, or do you convince the public that Trump can overcome his temperament?
And will we, I guess the strategy for the Democrats tonight and them encouraging Joe Biden to provoke Trump enough so that the real Trump comes out. And I'm thinking, well, of course you can do that. Anybody can do that. I mean, can you get Trump to be Trump? Hell yes, you can get Trump to be Trump. That doesn't take much. You can.
Yes, yeah. Can you get someone to be show more stamina for one night, or can you get the leopard to change his spots?
Yeah.
I think that's the underlying question of the two.
No, but my underlying question is why will that matter? Why will that matter if Trump comes on and acts like Trump, even in extreme ways? Maybe that loses the middle, but it doesn't lose his base. And he can recover that pretty quickly over the next 3 months through other smoke and mirrors in the media. Again, with, as I mentioned earlier, with his vice presidential pick, which could be huge, hugely important. And then, I'm sorry, bigly important, very bigly important. And, or any of these other things. I mean, he's great at the headline game. So if you get Trump to be Trump, does that really matter?
No, I think this is the question. If we're looking at this at the beginning of the process, let's think of this as uh, I'll use the metaphor, the beginning of the at bat. And how many strikes can each candidate have? So, look, Trump perhaps gets a strike tonight if he loses his temper. But you could say he then does better, gets a hit if he has a right vice presidential pick. He could also pick a total sycophant or Kristi Noem or someone who's seen as completely unqualified but loyal to him, and then that's strike two. So there's questions of how they play this. I think there's still a lot to unfold, but this sets the tone for this phase of the debate. And I also think this brings in a lot of the folks who have been not paying attention, on the sidelines, not as focused as the true political, the two political players, the political elites, those type who have been focused on this the whole time. A lot of folks have tuned out on this based on their reluctance or dislike of both candidates. I don't think anything tonight is going to change their dislike or reluctance for any of these candidates, but it's those issues on the margin of temperament, of stamina, that are important for those folks who are going to decide one way or the other. I don't think this does anything for the true partisans other than give them the little clips and snippets they're going to use in the back and forth going forward. But among the double haters, this is where the perceptions are formed, or starting to be formed, headed from now into November.
So, all right, those that hate both sides and those, can there be something, this transformational moment where the Democrats give up on Joe Biden? That seems to be the big rumor in Washington we're hearing. There's a way that he's going to fall on his face so badly tonight that they're going to come up with a new candidate when they see that he can't possibly do it before the convention. The convention's in what, 6 weeks, 5 weeks?
Convention's at the end of August, but there's all these other factors. They're moving ahead with a virtual session because they have to get on the Ohio ballot. There's all these matters of ballot access and other things that are already starting and taking place that make it very hard, if not impossible now, to replace this candidate short of something tragic or act of God type happening. So therefore, you're in a point, this talk perhaps in December of last year, January of this year, could have had some kernel of truth to it. Nowadays, we're locked into this. I think it's very unlikely. There's very little mechanism other than at the convention. And because of the calendar, this convention itself is going to be a formality. The actual nomination will be carried out virtually earlier. So all of this timeline is not there to replace this yet, nor do I think the mechanisms or infrastructure would be able to get up to speed in time.
Okay, let me, and I apologize, ladies and gentlemen, but this is I just want to know. I want to know if President Biden were to have a catastrophic health event, if he were to have a health event that would prevent him from completing his term at this point. If there were something obvious that happened to him, it does happen to elderly people who are in perhaps the most stressful job in the world. This is not an absurd conjecture, and I'm not hoping for it, and I wish the president well, and I'm saying my prayers for him. Certainly Joe Biden, the man, I hope he's okay and does very well and remains healthy long into his much older years. But were something to happen to him in the next 2 months, what happens, Dan?
So a lot of the question happens on when this would happen. Of course, with the president and the actual presidential duties, a lot of that would come down to whether he's incapacitated under the 25th Amendment, and then Kamala Harris, as vice president, would assume the powers of the presidency or become president, depending on the scope of this scenario. A lot of it, though, comes down to, does it happen before or after the conventions or the formal nomination, or even if it happens before the Electoral College sits, if this happens between the election and the seating of the Electoral College. So many of these things, though, aren't written out. They're hypotheticals. And all I can really do is actually direct you all, because we would be going on for a half hour. There's an article about this at the Brookings Institute. They wrote about it back in September of last year, but it's by Elaine Kmark, a good scholar there. And I can only point you in that direction for further detail on this, because otherwise we'd be going down a very long rabbit hole, Michael.
Okay. If Vice President Harris were to assume the responsibilities of president or become president, that does not necessarily mean she would become the de facto nominee, or does it?
In a sense of the party infrastructure, in the sense of how they move forward, yes, she would be de facto. It becomes a question of the legalities of whether she would immediately become it or whether they would have to somehow renominate her.
Or renominate her. And then it goes to the topic of her vice presidential pick to fill in at that point. Okay.
But
Uh,
but then that's the point, you're living in what will be pages in a U.S. history book down the way.
Okay. We've sadly in my life, I've lived through a number of those. Just when you least think it could happen, it happens. Dan, what are you expecting tonight other than this sort of cringe-worthy moment after cringe-worthy moment? What do you expect? And we've got to go.
I think looking for President Biden really focusing on stamina, trying to seem that he's with it. For former President Trump, controlling that temper, as we've said. That gag order on the Manhattan case has been lifted. That I thought in some ways was a gift that kind of kept him from talking about this. Now that that's no longer there, if he seems distracted, angry, I don't think that benefits him, besides those who already believe him.
Okay, we're going to watch tonight. And as we did a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Jeffrey Lacker, as he came on and talked about what he expected before the Fed meeting, and we followed up after the Fed meeting, we're going to have Dan back next week after this. We might even do a special. If something profound happens tonight, we will do a special tomorrow for the weekend to get Dan's comments back on. If it's de rigueur, we'll wait till next week. Dan, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming back with Dr. Claudia Sahm, and she is responsible for the Sahm rule. An economist, has been with the Fed, and is a very bright, even-keeled economist. We're going to learn something. Please stay with us.
Michael Farr and the FarrCast are proud to support Heroes, Inc. Heroes supports the spouses and children of law enforcement officers and firefighters who gave their lives in the line of duty to the greater Washington, D.C. community. Their singular goal is to honor the supreme sacrifice made by these individuals by caring for their families. Heroes' work begins within 24 hours of the tragic loss and continues indefinitely. We invite you to learn more about Heroes' mission at heroes.org. We hope that you will consider supporting Heroes as they endeavor to honor those who protect us. That's heroes.org. Heroes, here for you, here for good. And now, back to the FarrCast and your host, Michael Farr. We appreciate you listening into the FarrCast this week. And now to introduce this week's special guest, here's your host, Michael Farr.
Welcome back to the FarrCast. I am Michael Farr. It's the 27th day of June. Here we are at the end of the second quarter. Presidential debate tonight. The Fed has been quiet for, well, sort of quiet. We're hearing different Fed governors come out and argue with one another sort of publicly in their statements. We do need to lower rates. We don't need to lower rates. I think maybe we should raise rates. Heard that this week, too. I could be talked into another rate hike. Is inflation hot? Is it coming down? You remember, ladies and gentlemen, we've talked about the real rate as opposed to the nominal rate. That real rate is right now, let's say it's 2% just for grins. And we're going to ask Dr. Sahm in a minute what she thinks the real rate might be. But if the Fed funds rate is 5.3 and inflation is running at 3.3, then the real rate is 2. The difference between 3.3 and 5.3 is 2%. Got it. So that's the real cost of money. And if inflation comes down to 3%, then the real rate goes to 2.3%. And if it goes lower, then the real rate goes up. And as that real rate goes up, that's a real pressure, real headwind, stepping on the brakes of economic growth by the Federal Reserve. That's what they've tried to do. Will they reach a point where they say, whoa, they've stepped on the brakes too much, and even though economic activity looks okay, They recognize that they need to lower rates because they don't want that real rate to be any higher. They don't want that gap to be any wider, and therefore they follow the rate of inflation growth lower. When do they do it? Will they blink? Will they stay high too long and cause recession? These are all the questions that run through my head. I know that makes me sound like kind of a wonky, nerdy guy, and you're not wrong. You're not wrong. I love this stuff. I love economics, and I love figuring out how it's going to affect not only the US, how it's going to affect markets, not only in the US, but world markets. They're all intertwined. We have a interwovenness of the economic global fabric of the world, and you don't move one without seeing a reaction somewhere else. Economics very similar to physics in Farr's view, but never mind. Dr. Claudia Sahm is chief economist at New Century Advisors, a seriously highly regarded expert on the macroeconomy and monetary and fiscal policy. She was at the Federal Reserve. She talks with a lot of the decision makers at the White House and Congress and developed the Sahm rule, which we're going to hear about. Dr. Sahm, welcome to the FarrCast. It's a great honor to have you with us.
Great. Thank you to be here.
Well, it's terrific to have you. So let's start, if you don't mind, with your view of the economy in general right now. And is the Fed got it right? Has the Fed got it wrong? And then tell us about the Sahm rule. Yep, any and all.
Okay. Well, first of all, when we think about where the economy is right now, it's good.
Yeah.
Like, it's for as much, and we should always be concerned looking around the corner. But if we think about where we were 2 years ago, even a year ago, this time last summer, this was before the disinflation really started to pick up, and things were pretty rough. We are living the elusive soft landing, the getting the inflation down, avoiding the recession. We're not there yet, but really, like, there's a lot to not just celebrate, but step back and be like, what just happened?
Yeah.
Like, to really help, we need to push ourselves on our understanding of inflation that we have just seen, so that we can get a sense of how to interpret the inflation that we are learning about right now, or we're trying to forecast.
Right.
Right. So I think, first of all, it's like right now we're in a good place. Now, that's not good enough. And because we are in a place where the Fed is very active and that they have interest rates held high, we can, discuss how high it is, right? But they are clearly putting pressure on the economy. Defaults are up, and interest sensitive sectors like housing are really taking something of a hit. Okay, so the Fed is in the game. Monetary policy in the real world takes time to work.
Yes.
Like we can have Fed Chair Jay Powell sneeze at a press conference and markets move in real time, but that doesn't show up on the stickers at the price register, that people are buying, right? Like, it takes a long time to get to the outcomes that we really care about. So then we're in the game of forecasting. And as I said, the inflation forecasting has always been difficult. I think, frankly, in the years coming up to COVID, it was because of why we couldn't get inflation up to 2%. And now it's this, how can we not get it down? And then layer on top of that, we have gotten to a place where jobs are out there. The unemployment rate is very low, but it is not like jobless claims data, very low, but they're not as great as they were even last year. So then you're in a situation where you've got two risks that you have to look at, the bad risks, or you have to think about, well, is inflation going to pick up again, or is it not going to get stuck? Or I guess we don't have, these aren't necessarily exclusive, do we have the economy slow down and then employment? So and there's been a lot more discussion about this piece on the slowing labor market, the economy might be slower. That's come into discussion again. It was kind of a thing in 2022. Everybody said we're having a recession. I think that passed. So we should have these discussions, but it's not a done deal. And yet these are so important for the Fed because they can't, I'm not sure this is totally sunk into popular discussion, but if the Fed waits until it's clear,
Yes.
it's too late.
It's too late.
Oh, and especially on the recessions. I mean, people are like, oh, if we get inflation less than 3, like inflation mistakes on the downside, if they don't come with a recession, which sometimes we have low inflation without a recession, it's like, oh, okay, fine. But like a recession is bad. And frankly, anything that gets us ever closer to a recession, like growth is good, right? Sustainable, solid growth is good. But we can definitely agree that a recession is a particularly bad outcome. But if you wait until you see it, like it's staring you in the face, if the Fed waits, then they've waited too long because they can't stop it. And frankly, we're in an environment where you're not going to have a fiscal policy response in
Have
all
they
likelihood.
waited too long? Have they waited too long?
When my view, my heart goes out to them. This is a tough job. Although this is what they get paid the big bucks for. Uh, their
Ladies
job
and
is,
gentlemen, the Fed governors don't get paid big bucks.
yeah, I
They
was,
get paid, yeah. These are not $1 million a year folks. These are
no,
100 and change a year folks.
yeah. Well, at least not until after their government job is done.
Good.
Then many are paid more again. So no, but
No, you don't hear about them going out and writing that torch song Thriller about their years as an economist at the Fed. I mean,
no.
it's one
Yeah,
thing if you were on the National Intelligence Committee as a member of Congress, you might have some good juice about the
no,
arguments you heard in the halls or even at the White House. The economists at the Fed don't. Oh, let me tell you my great, really fascinating story on
yeah,
economics.
yeah.
Doesn't sell a lot, but sorry, I digress.
No, go for it. It sounds fun.
So, uh, uh, have have they waited too long, Dr. Sahm?
In my opinion, there's a very strong case to start cutting gradually with a clear signal to financial markets that this is not the whole path. This is just, we're going to start very much like the European Central Bank began their process, right? And that comes if inflation has moved down substantially towards their target. Right. So for me, the case begins with the inflation path and the momentum towards a 2% policy. They could wait until inflation is at 2%, has been there for several months, then begin to cut and have an event in the world happen that pushes up inflation. Like say, I mean,
Sure.
a variety of different kinds of events. Right. And that's not a mistake. It's just there is no certainty in this game. So you have to make the case. It's like, are we moving towards the target? When in my understanding and training on monetary policy is when you get to a place that is like when we are at the dual mandate, the 2% inflation, the low unemployment, the Fed should be out of the way. I shouldn't be able to see them interest rate sensitive sectors. I shouldn't see that, because we can have a strong growth economy that is not inflationary. And there's a lot of reasons to think part of the reason the US has strong growth is because of immigration, because of productivity, and so the Fed should not be leaning excessively on the economy because it's unnecessary. So I think, avoiding but there's definitely a concern among the Fed officials, and you'll hear this frankly from almost all of them, that you don't, one of the worst possible mistakes would be to cut, then have inflation come back, and they have to raise rates.
Well,
So
in the 1930s, after the Great Depression, that was indeed the error that the Fed made, right? They cut too soon.
and they can, yes, this isn't policy error. We should avoid policy errors, right? And so that's what you do want, to be with evidence that we are moving towards 3%, not at 3%, moving. What I find problematic is a policy error is also an unforced recession or an unnecessary recession.
Yes.
And I think the balance of those two, and there's a lot of reasons why monetary policy, we think about credibility and thinking about what's the last policy mistake that was made on inflation. I think as inflation gets ever closer to 3%, or I'm sorry, as inflation gets ever closer to 2%,
yes,
that balance of the risk ought to be shifting. And I don't see that yet. But I get it. We're in the space of risk, but it is important to note that we have seen in the past year, very notable improvement on inflation. And also, I guess the other thing I would give as a background to it is I interpret much of the inflation progress we've made as having come through the unwinding of disruptions we saw early in the pandemic or from the war in Ukraine. Right.
Which
so there is
were transitory, just took longer time to transit.
Yes. And at the last press conference, Jay Powell said something, along these lines. That kind of inflation, that's not about needing to create, quote unquote, slack in the economy. That's not about the Fed holding rates high to get demand down, because demand is the problem. It's your unwinding other kinds. Now the Fed is standing there to make sure that demand doesn't start, taking off another way. Like I get it. And again, I'm not advocating that they come in July and cut 200 basis points off the federal funds rate.
Right.
If you get going and you go gradually, that can help avoid a very disruptive Sunday evening where the Fed gets together and cuts the federal funds rate by 200 basis points.
And
we've
seen versions of that in the past. We saw them more frequently under Greenspan, but we saw them in 2008, certainly over the weekend with Bear Stearns and others. All right. So here's the way I think about it. Dr. Sahm. I am not an economist, though I do play one on TV and have for many years. Here's what I'm seeing and what I continue to always preach, which is the U.S. consumer is the foundation of the U.S. economy. Right now, the U.S. consumer is starting to see delinquencies in credit card bills. The U.S. consumer is seeing even some delinquencies on mortgage payments. The U.S. consumer that was awash with cash through largely entitlements to stave off a huge depression, which we saw coming given the pandemic. The consumer is now employed. The labor force participation rate is back up. Maybe it's not ideal, but it looks pretty relative. The consumer is employed and the consumer's running out of money, and the consumer is now, the savings rate is as low as it's been in a long time. The consumer's running out of wallet. And when the consumer runs out of wallet, that means pressure on demand. And I think we're seeing those inflationary numbers come down in CPI and other places, PCE deflator coming down. Therefore, that more than anything else that I kind of watch, that health of the consumer. Do they have wallet? Do they have the capacity? If they have the capacity to spend, the U.S. consumer will spend, period. Better than any other citizen of the world, in my opinion, the U.S. consumer will spend. So to that point, even though I look at my screen today and see that Amazon's over $2 trillion in market cap, and I worry about the wealth effect from any hint of Fed easing that will just exacerbate spending and demand, I don't think that does. Stock market can go up with a wealth effect, and that cohort that controls that wealth are not the big spenders. They can't create a velocity of money, or they haven't historically created a velocity. It's the lower half, it's the lower 2/3, it's the lower 3/4 that's running out of money. And therefore, I think if you're not saying the Fed should start to consider easing, I think they probably should at some point over the next couple of 3 months to get ahead of this a bit, and they can do it slowly and deliberately. But I say based on the consumer, they really should. And where am I? If I got that, do you think I'm stupid? You wouldn't be the first.
No. The consumer is absolutely the place to focus. And then that ties very much to watching the labor market for signs of how healthy the consumer. I agree with you. Wealth effects are very much overplayed. And frankly, looking at kind of empirical relationships, they've gotten smaller and smaller over time. And it's probably some of that's due to the wealth inequality rising, which is exactly what you said, where that money is going. Are these people who are in any way, shape, or form constrained by their spending, and then their Amazon stocks go up so they can spend. So I think wealth is not the place to be concerned about in terms of kind of stoking inflation. On the other piece on the consumer side, I think is important. And it's hard to get a grasp on this. I have a sense this goes beyond the necessity cutting back, but you definitely see from some of the consumer consumer discretionary, or just in general businesses in the consumer space, where they're really having to put the deals on or start to pull back on some of the big price increases. The best cure for high inflation is high inflation, right? At the end of the day, the businesses, they write the prices down, and if they can get them, I mean, if people will buy it for that and they can get those profits, then absolutely they have a responsibility to their shareholders. That's what they do. I think for a lot of reasons, the bargain or the pricing power shifted much more to businesses, corporations included during this cycle. And we've seen this in so many dimensions of this economy. We are undergoing something of a normalization, where
Yes.
those prices won't necessarily fall. Although I think in some cases, this time we may actually get more of that than would be typical outside of, say, the Great Depression.
Yep.
But you need, like, the Fed needs that. Like, it's like they need the assist from the consumers being like, no,
Right.
no, we're not paying this. And I think that actually goes beyond people who could, like, there's real stress that these prices are causing. I also interacting with people who can pay are not happy about it.
Yes.
Right. And if you vote, if you are, so you make that vocal enough, like, the companies will have to back to, or at least try to, like, kind of or try to actually compete with each other on price. Like, that's the
Hey, how
thing.
about that?
so,
Dr. Sahm, I want to get to the Sahm rule quickly because we're out
yeah,
of time. We've
yeah.
got to go. I will also just share with listeners that often, and maybe a number of you have heard it when I go out and speak around the country, one thing that I say, and I said this a couple of weeks ago, I spoke to a private club of very wealthy, older people, and I pointed out, look, if I gave everybody in the room $10,000 today, what would you do with it? And this is a big question, because the answer for the wealthy older people in the room is they're going to go put it in their money market at Schwab or Fidelity or Merrill Lynch or somewhere. If you gave that $10,000 to the average shopper down each aisle at Walmart, half of it would be spent at Walmart that day before they could get out of the Walmart. So that's the difference of the velocity of money and the concentration of wealth, and the difference is why Amazon doesn't make sense. But people having jobs, we're back to that consumer here as we close out with Dr. Claudia Sahm, and what a treat to have you on. It really is. This is awesome. So the Sahm rule, please, why it's important and when we should be worried.
So the Sahm is a recession indicator that I developed that was named after me later. It picks up this logic that you'll see other economists point to. This is not a new thing, and this is important to pay attention to. In the labor market, things, when they start to slow, you have a dynamic that is a snowball turning into an avalanche with a recession. Recessions start very gradual, particularly if you look and say the unemployment rate. What the Sahm rule does is it looks for what is the smallest increase in the unemployment rate, and I'm looking at 3-month averages, and it's a little bit of a smoothing out to it. But what is the smallest increase in the unemployment rate that says, hey, we're in a recession, or is consistent with, in the past we have been in a recession? And just to get a sense of how small this is, and I'm just doing an indicator, like, are we in a recession? I'm not in the forecasting business, not competing with the yield curve. I'm like, just, here, are we here? And if the unemployment rate, this 3-month average, is up a 0.5 percentage point, so this is small, right? 0.5 percentage point relative to its low over the prior 12 months, we are in the first 3-4 months of a recession in it. So, and that's a small, because when you think about in a recession, the mildest recession, 2001, 2 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, typically is closer to 4. So it's this trying to get at the very beginning. And that's where I said, if a policymaker waits until it is so blatantly obvious that, recession, then it's not even as too late. Like, we are in one, and then a dynamic, it often can, the feedback effects can really get going in terms of laid off workers stop spending, and then more workers get laid off, and then so on and so forth. So but there's nothing. I was going and looking, right? Like, what does this look like empirically? there's nothing magical about 0.5%. And many of my peers look at, well, what is the increase that's typical before recession starts, right? And obviously that's smaller, right? But it's not but it is this idea that you can't just say, oh, well, the level is really low. The unemployment rate is really low. It's okay. Well, as I look, the unemployment, we've had recessions out of low unemployment rates before. It's about the changes, and it makes sense. It's like, how are things changing? And you gotta like watch carefully. But we are not in a place right now, though the unemployment rate has increased. It is not oh wow, we're in a recession. It certainly is in a place of, we need to pay attention to this, and we also need to understand there are no rules. Right, like in a true sense of like, this time has had many unusual aspects. So it's
Boy, I knew I was going to learn a lot. I didn't know I was going to learn that much. What a great guest you are! Thank you so much. We hope you'll come back. Claudia Sahm is chief economist, New Century Advisors, the author of the Sahm Rule. I believe, ladies and gentlemen, remember I said this. We are talking to a future Fed governor and perhaps a future Fed chairman. Don't count her out to be Treasury Secretary. I'm telling you, I've been in Washington my whole life, and what a difference 10 years make. This is a rising star, PhD from University of Michigan. And you've already heard, folks, you know something that a lot of people around the world didn't know. This is a really nice person, too. That matters. It's an economist with a personality, folks. Pay attention to the career of Claudia Sahm. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
That's it for another FarrCast, ladies and gentlemen, as we cover Wall Street, Washington, and the world, bringing you insiders to help us better understand the economy and the government and how it all interplays and how it will ultimately affect our portfolios. We hope you enjoyed this one. I certainly did. We'll be back next week doing it all again. Post debate, maybe a special tomorrow with our political analyst, Dan Mahaffee, if things really go nuts tonight. It's kind of hard to imagine that they won't, but who knows? If they go nuts tonight, we'll be back with a special tomorrow. Otherwise, we'll be back and see you next week. Thanks for being with us. For Harry Jennings, our producer, everybody at Hightower Advisors and Farr Miller in Washington, please share us on your social media. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend. I'm Michael Farr.
Thanks for joining us this week, and thanks to our guest, Dan Mahaffee, and special guest, Dr. Claudia Sahm. Watch this week for special July 4th and debate coverage. The FarrCast is produced by Michael Farr and Harry Jennings and comes to you weekly for free on all major podcast platforms, including Spotify, TuneIn, and Apple Podcasts. You can stream past episodes as well as subscribe so you never miss a new one. We love reading all of your notes and comments, and we try to reply to as many as we can. You can reach us at hjennings@farrmiller.com. Let us know any questions you have about past episodes or questions you'd like us to answer in upcoming shows. Take care, stay safe, and stay healthy. Thanks for listening to the FarrCast. Wall Street, Washington, and the world. Farr Miller in Washington is a group comprised of investment professionals registered with Hightower Advisors, LLC, and a SEC-registered investment advisor. Some investment professionals may also be registered with Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA and SIPC. Advisory services are offered through Hightower Advisors, LLC. Securities are offered through Hightower Securities, LLC. All information referenced herein is from sources believed to be reliable. Farr Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC have not independently verified the accuracy or completeness of the information contained in this podcast. Farr Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC and any of its affiliates make no representations or warranties, expressed or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information or for statements or errors or omissions or results obtained from the use of this information. Farr Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC and any of its affiliates assume no liability for any action made or taken in reliance on or relating in any way to the information. This podcast and the materials contained herein were created for informational purposes only. The opinions expressed are solely those of the authors and do not represent those of Hightower Advisors, LLC or any of its affiliates. Farr Miller in Washington and Hightower Advisors, LLC or any of its affiliates do not provide tax or legal advice. This material was not intended or written to be used or presented in any way to any entity as tax or legal advice. Clients are urged to consult their tax and/or legal advisors for related questions.